Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5 Minute Catholic Apologetics, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about how the majority of people who leave the Catholic faith don't know what they're leaving. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti, Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Many of you, if not all of you, have lapsed Catholics or even lapsed Christians that are no longer practicing their faith. We know that the largest group of identified people in America now that's growing are anons, or are not affiliated, spiritual but religious. And this is something that is affecting not just the Catholic faith, but the Protestant faith. Certainly the mainline Protestant faiths are dying off. The Catholic faith is growing. If you look globally, it is exploding, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, and we are the largest religious group in the world. We're over 1.2 billion. But here in the West, where we're two of this world instead of in this world, secularism has definitely crept into the Christian faiths, including the Catholic faith. And for a variety of reasons, you might have had Catholics who've left the faith. And I would say, look, the majority of Catholics don't know what they're leaving. Now, who don't know what they're leaving, in that it is the church founded by Jesus Christ. It's the fullness of the faith. Historically, it's vindicated. Theologically, it's true. We've had one holy Catholic apostolic church. Catholic meaning universal. We've had that since the apostolic era. Again, for all you Protestants, you can read the early church fathers, and they will attest to the veracity of the Catholic faith, because you can read their writings, whether it be the Didache or Justin Martyr or Clement of Rome or Irenaeus or Augustine, all these guys, and their beliefs are very Catholic, and they believed in what we would perceive to be today the Catholic Church. Yes, there's been flourishments and an evolution of thoughts, but they're all consistent with the early church. But most Catholics who leave the faith just don't know this. They don't know the faith. And why is this? Well, they're poorly catechized. And we know there's been an epidemic of poor catechesis in the last several decades. And it's not like the catechesis prior to Vatican II was that great, but back then, people still lived in a neighborhood. They lived in a ghetto surrounded by like-minded people. So all the Poles hung out together, all the Germans hung out together, and so forth. And then after World War II, really with the suburbanization of America, then people started leaving the neighborhoods, and they went off to suburbia, which was much more heterogeneous. And then with the advent of television, certainly you saw propaganda begin, and you saw that a lot of Catholics, albeit we're not as well knowledgeable of their faith, at least we're surrounded by Catholic world. And as they moved to suburbia, they were no longer surrounded by that Catholic world. And I think that parents have done a poor job, because I think parents think that it's the church's job to teach their kids about the faith, and they forget that they make the baptismal vow that they will be raising the kids in the faith, but also educating them in the faith. And kids who become adults are much more likely to believe the faith and understand the faith if they're taught the faith, instead of just waiting for a once a week Sunday school lesson. That's not how it works. If you want your kids to be Catholic, you have to know the faith. This is why I think that a lot of parishes do a great disservice when they focus all their evangelization on the children and none on the adults. None of the adults. And we've had 3 generations where each generation, like your grandparents would go to Mass, they kind of knew the faith very well, and then their kids would maybe go to Mass here and there, like the kids in the 80s and 90s here and there, but they didn't know their faith as well. And then their kids barely know the faith at all. And it's just this lessening of knowledge that you can see played out in I mean, look, the Native Americans in the 19th century were talking the same way. Why don't these kids listen to the wise man who holds the peace pipe? You know, so we can certainly say that. A lot of people say this. But they don't know what they're leaving. You look at atheists, especially atheists who come from a Christian background, when they talk about Christianity, you can tell they know nothing about Christianity. What they know about Christianity is either A, what they learned from other atheist sources, or B, what they remember that was taught to them when they were very young, when they were 7, 8, 9 years old, and they still have this childhood view of the Christian faith, and they still think that's what the Christian faith taught, but they either have a child view of it or they were improperly taught it. And those Catholics that go to Protestant faiths, it's the same thing. They're like, many of them are just detached. They didn't really have good catechesis, and they're too much of this world, so they support, let's say, homosexual marriage or something like that. And then they go to a mega church, and they're like, first of all, they get attacked, like, you worship Mary, the Pope's the Antichrist. How can you not believe the Bible is the sole guidebook for Christian living? And if the Catholic is not really rooted in their faith, and they're susceptible to it, they'll start believing this. And then they go to these worship and praise services that the megachurches do, which is all emotion, lacking substance. And therefore they get caught up in that. And it's this kind of dual tandem of bad timing. And then you have poorly catechized Catholics mixed with the emotionality and the fellowship that you find in a megachurch. And there's nothing wrong with fellowship per se, but they wouldn't be leaving the faith if they understood the importance of the sacraments, if they understood they were receiving the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, true transubstantiation. And only the Catholic faith and the Orthodox have this. Certainly there are some Protestants who will do a communion service maybe once a week. It's rare, but maybe once a month or once a quarter. And certainly a lot of the megachurches don't even do it at all. But if you knew you were receiving, as Christ intended, you see in John 6 and 1 Corinthians 11 with St. Paul, you were receiving the body and blood of Christ. You wouldn't leave that. If you had a true, full understanding of the sacraments and their efficacious use and the graces that we give from them, you wouldn't leave that. You wouldn't leave confession. You wouldn't leave last rites. You wouldn't leave the sacrament, the graces you get from the sacrament of marriage. If you knew that you had the full Bible as was written, as was read for 1,500 years before the Protestant Reformation, all 73 books, you wouldn't leave that. But the thing is, like, it's a lot of it's just ignorance. They were not properly taught. They didn't know better. And then part of it is the church's fault. We give them Sunday school until they're 13, until they get confirmation, and that's it. We would never do that for regular education. You know what? You're 13. You don't have to keep going back to middle school and high school. You have all the knowledge you need. That's asinine. We would never do that. But we're not going to pass laws. They're not going to pass laws that say that you have to go to Sunday school or some form of Christian formation, RCIA, whatever it is, until you're 18. They're never going to pass that civilly. So I don't know what needs to be done, but something needs to be done. If you look at who leaves the Catholic faith, it's normally Catholics who are not, it's either they have an issue with one of the social teachings of the church, or they had a bad experience with a priest, or maybe someone in their family had a bad experience with a priest. Let's say the priest said no to them cremating the ashes of grandma and wearing him on a necklace or something like that. And since they don't have the knowledge of why the church teaches these things, not just on cremation, but on anything, why does the church teach these things? They don't know the theology of the body. So when it comes to fornication and contraception and the prohibition on homosexual marriage, they don't have a grasp of the church's teaching on the theology of the body, for example. So of course they're more likely to leave it, because secular world and megachurches are essentially an extension of that, because megachurches are essentially a form of lazy Christianity. They're going to go to that because they're too of this world instead of being in this world. And as a whole, who leaves the Catholic faith? It's mostly people who don't know the faith, and they'll go to megachurches. And then you see the other way. Who's going to leave the Protestant faith? It's typically those Protestants who are better educated. Maybe they have a master's in divinity or whatever it is, or they read history, and then they go to the Catholic faith or Orthodox faith. By the way, if people had the true fullness of the faith, if they would read the Catechism and understand the faith and were taught it well, there's no reason to leave the faith. It's like in John 6, when Jesus is telling them repeatedly, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And then the people were like, what are you saying? We can't believe this. And then people left. Jesus is saying, you know what? I was talking figuratively. Come back. And then he's making the point. Remember, and we talked about it in the Gospel of John treatment. John's written a good 3 generations after Christ's death. So there was a Christian community. You have to know, like, who is this being written for? And Jesus turns to the apostles, are you going to leave too? And Peter says what we all should believe. Lord, where would we go? You have the words of eternal life. And so when you're in the Catholic faith, you have nowhere else to go because you're in the fullness of the faith founded by Jesus Christ on the rock that is Peter. He created a visible institutional church. You have nowhere else to go. You have the fullness of the faith. Sure, of course, you can go to a Protestant faith or you can be atheist or whatever it is. And you'll have incomplete partial parts of the faith, of the fullness of the faith. But you don't have the fullness. And when you're Catholic, that's it. You have the fullness. Doesn't mean you're going to go to heaven. Doesn't mean you're guaranteed to go to heaven. Of course not. But you have the fullness of the faith. And it's a question of, are you cooperating with that fullness of the faith of all the graces that you can get? Are you cooperating with it? By the way, if Catholics were fully formed in their faith, they wouldn't be leaving the faith. So really the onus is on parents and on parishes to do a better job. And you see this. I go to trad parishes and I see these kids. I've talked about in the episode on what I learned from teaching Sunday school. I was teaching 10th graders. These kids can have their own YouTube channel. They know it's well. And why do that? Because the parents make it a priority to teach it to them. So it's a question of, we can all, most guys can name the 20 starting quarterbacks in the NFL, but couldn't tell you define transubstantiation. The women could tell you probably all the characters of the Real Housewives of fill in the blank city, but they can't name the 4 Marian dogmas. And again, it's a lack of our priority. So we need to make it a priority because we don't want our family to leave. And the statistics, albeit the church is growing, of course, in the world, in America, we are losing more and more, not just Catholics and Christians. Yes, there's pockets of growth, but as a whole, they're leaving. And so we have to identify this. And certainly the bishops of their diocese need to identify this and change our religious education because it isn't working. What we've been doing for the last 40 years has not been working. And doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result, we know what that is the definition of. So we need to change it. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. Until next time, take care, God bless, and pray.